Good afternoon. Thank you to Bhutan Echoes for having a fashion journalist at a literature festival. Thank you, Jempel, for the generous introduction. I was invited to offer a context to what a fashion writer might do, possibly justifying a resume amidst the diversity of work we see here. So I brought you some images that speak of my work and in a representational way speak of what a fashion, culture, textile writer might do to find their way to Bhutan. So textile, attire, and identity, cultural intersections in fashion, that's the subject I was assigned by the Bhutan Echoes team. I wanted to start with these two images. It's a 10-minute conversation with images with my commentary. The first is a lady from a tribe in Kutch in Western India who cannot show her face to any man who's not her husband, brother, father, or son. And she lives a kind of a closeted life. But look at the vocabulary of design that she's wearing and the way the border is edged, the patterning that is on her garment. And so when we lead to ideas of cultural appropriation, of how fashion gets influenced, that's the image I have put on top, contrasted with a work, a creation from designer Gaurav Gupta, based in Delhi, who now shows at the Haute Couture Week in Paris. And that's also from India, and you can see the contrasts. And if I may, I want to say that my work thrives and lives on the conflicts, on the complexities, on the intersections that these two representative ideas make. Culture is first about labor. Labor creates enough, if it creates enough of surplus, as Terry Eagleton argues, then we have art, then we have industrial capitalism, then we have designers. And then designers say, we don't want to be like labor, we want to be like ourselves. So the designer starts flexing away from what has created him or her, thus offering individualism, and that in a manner is fashion journalism, one of the kinds of fashion journalism that is practiced. Next slide, please. Identity and textiles. Since the word identity was offered to me as my subject, I have grouped it here for this discussion as place, process, and material. These are the three things in terms of textile creation that pin it down to identity. The northeast of India, you have a weaver wearing an Adidas t-shirt. There is a sketch from one of the bazaars near Assam made by an Assamese artist and author. And there is a sewing machine in the center of the bazaar, and she's wearing a COVID mask. And that is an image of textiles woven in the Gyasar brocades technique that you are familiar with, and that's why they sit here. This is more or less the vocabulary that I jostle inside, as does my team: artisan, cultural economy, wage parity, worker welfare, orthodoxy, democracy, caste, semiotics. So this is how storytelling is created on the crux of these ideas. Each is very complex, but this is the color palette, metaphorically, of our work. Next slide, please. Representation and communication. You probably know these images through the media. So there's the Indian team at Olympics opening ceremony, the set of garments highly criticized, created by Indian couturier Tarun Teliani for their missing contemporary aesthetic. There is the Mongolian team, the most praised uniforms at the Olympics, also a culture and identity connect. The watermelon clutch by this Indian actor at Cannes is representative of her protest to stand up for the Palestine, Gaza, Hamas, Israel conflict that's going on, and she uses this bag in the colors of the flag to say where she stands. Hima Das won at the Olympics a few years back. She wore not only the Indian flag, but the gamcha woven in Assam, her home state, to talk about where she came from, who she was. Next slide, please. Textiles, politics, and semiotics. I wanted to get this out of the way because it's a very important part of how we look at attire in India. Mamata Banerjee, West Bengal Chief Minister, that photograph is particularly leading because she stands next to a nun from the Mother Teresa convent. And Mamata Didi's attire, her saris, are usually white lined with blue. And there is a kind of a connect she traces with what she stands for through her cloth. She stands for service, she says. You must notice in her clothes and attire this year, she's been wearing the Apple smartwatch. She counts her steps, and I'm sure they are more than 10,000. Gandhi I have placed here because the reference still continues. The most important promoter of textile and identity is the father of the nation. Then there is the gamcha. Now the gamcha you saw in the previous slide on Hima Das. There is the gamcha on perhaps an ordinary working class person on a cycle. There is the finance minister's way of using hand-woven fabric to reject the briefcase that male finance ministers would take to talk about the budget and to announce the budget. And Mrs. Sitharaman, that's a cropped image, uses this interpretation of the accountant's notebook, the red Bahai Khata as we call it, to bring the budget to the public and to the country. And then the Prime Minister wearing a Manipuri interpretation of the gamcha as a COVID mask to address the nation in 2020. Next slide, please. The sari is a cultural destination, as you know. I have been watching here your Kira and Go, and it is a cultural destination. It speaks of so many narratives and linked stories. And the sari in India is a lot more complex, I feel, because it has been modernized, fashionized, rejected, taken away from the petticoat. The blouses have had their own revolutions and rebellions. But I want to draw your attention to this photograph. One of the columnists who wrote for the magazine that I edit, The Voice of Fashion, she argued that if a marriage is good, the quality of the textile woven by a weaver couple is synchronous and its tactility is smoother and better. We called it weaving marriages. And she showed how the same family, when it is employed in doing the same job together, does not necessarily work as opposition in the house, but as a team, and you get better quality textiles. And that is an image from Tamil Nadu. This is from Kalakshetra. I don't know if you have heard of this institute started by a dancer, but the Kalakshetra saris became their own idiom in India, started by Rukmani Devi Arundale. And she created a grammar of the border and the checks and the colors that became the Kalakshetra sari. I'll go there last. This is an image from the G20 in India that was held recently. And you see, it's not only the President of India, Draupadi Murmu, wearing the sari, which is her cultural destination, but the First Lady of Japan, Yuko Kishida, wearing it as beautifully in the navy drape, the way I'm wearing it, and arriving to connect. That image is from an exhibition called the Offbeat Sari. It was held at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 2023. And it showed how the sari had traveled out of its imperialistic gaze, its traditional gaze, the way I'm wearing it, maybe its colonized gaze, and it traveled long enough to go via fashion designers who stitched it, draped it in different ways, who rid it of its cholis, and it belonged to somebody else. So far, I have been arguing that identity is as much about the creator as the consumer. Here, the sari in this exhibition became about the consumer. If Zendaya wears a sari, she wears it in her own way. But how people wear the sari abroad, there was a pollution sari designed by an Indian designer which talked about recycled polymer and how that could effectively work as a rebellion against what's going on in terms of climate aggression. And there were these several drapes that were the auntie-skatey. So a skater auntie was wearing a sari. But it tells you that the sari has traveled out of its destination and it is being defined by those who wear it, and the person could be a Gen Z Canadian. It no longer need be an Indian. Next slide, please. So I'm jumping because Sheycha will soon come and examine me. Fault lines, we constantly work with these issues. Crafts washing, credit, collaboration. Whose craft is it? Who can culturally appropriate it? Who made our clothes? Do we know the names of those who made our clothes? In circular economy, is there a circularity of credit? Did a particular weaver, tailor wear my clothes? And if you ask me, who are you wearing? Am I able to tell you their names? Often not. So this image is from Fashion Revolution's globally acclaimed campaign to find out who made your clothes if you are really conscious of what you're wearing. That image is from Dior's show in India last year. Dior works in collaboration with the Chanakya School of Craft in Bombay to create embroideries that are used as wall hangings, as draperies, as surround decor pieces in their shows, but also for several couture garments that Dior shows. When it came to India, it had an exhibition where all the craftsmen who had done anything for Dior over the years since this collaboration were honored. They were called by name, and they were their faces were shown to the public as people. Often enough, what happens in India is fashion designers, those who do call karigars, artisans, to their fold, they show them working. Nobody else is working. People come to fashion shows to drink, to look at models, to look at designs, to look at patterns, fashions, but the artisans are shown working. And there is a discriminatory split saying they are workers and they may be creators, but we are the consumers, and the dominance, the power structure shifts. Chanakya School did otherwise. This is the gateway of India in Bombay. An entire tapestry embroidered by Indian artisans covered the gateway of India. It was hand embroidered and credited. Next slide, please. Cultural appropriation. So we'll talk about this when Sheycha asks me some questions. Only one motive I want to talk about. Ajrak is made in Sindh in Pakistan, and it is made in Gujarat in India. It has its own grammar, its ritualism, its colors, and it follows a certain idea of discipline that you can elasticate it by design so much, but you can't go overboard. This designer went overboard. You have skulls woven into the Ajrak pattern. Skulls are taboo for Muslim karigars anywhere in the world. In the region of Kutch in Gujarat, the karigars who weave these, who hand block these, they refused to create these skulls because it was out of their religious acceptance to do so. And yet, this jacket, it was then printed. Rajesh Pratap Singh, one of the country's most respected textile designers, heeded to this idea that you cannot offend people, especially when their religious sensitivities are involved. This garment, he got it printed with skulls in the Ajrak vocabulary. It was shown at the Fabric of India exhibition, also in London. That's a yoga motif copied by Dior from People Tree, a brand. People Tree accused Dior publicly. Dior made a settlement. The question that was asked then, yoga belongs to India or does it? Well, let's say it belongs to India. Hand block printing, the technique belongs to a Rajasthani community. Arijit Sen, the artist who created this block, belongs to somewhere else, and Dior then appropriates it. So plagiarization, derivation, inspiration, what was going on? Next slide, please. Fractures. The story shifts. Some of what, or much of what I may have argued so far, may be familiar to you, that this is what happens. Place, textile, material come together to create an identity. You are Bhutanese, I'm Indian. Then there are fractures where we move away, when there is a break which is conscious. Decolonizing textiles. In my work, I have tried to argue that decolonization is not about the British colonial rule or decolonizing from there. It is about freeing ourselves. As artists, as writers, we must, to create ikat only in a certain way, to create ajrak only in a certain way. When you move away from that, you decolonize from traditional ways of creating a certain garment or a certain pattern. And decolonizing textiles here very quickly. This is the houndstooth sari that's in the permanent exhibition at V&A in London, created by David Abraham and Rakesh Thakur. It has been woven on the ikat loom. This is a jamdani rug woven with steel and silk by another designer. This is again ikat patterned, but it is a rug that has been shaped like a lamp. This is a coat made completely by hand, but it has dolls. Every fabric used has Indian textiles, and it has been seamed by hand. There, the designer freed, decolonized. There is this vocabulary in brocade where the hunter is seen with the animals, the shikarga. Sanjay Garg of Raw Mango removed the hunter. So you had no pistol, no arrow, no person shooting the animals, but you had the animals. You had textures of animal skins. And with textiles, he showed that you can talk positively to climate change and animal protection and preservation by killing the hunter, not the animal. Next slide, please. This is just, we are running short of time, so I'm going to just show you the textile and read this. Shimmering golden ground lotus, lotus patterned in silk and silver gilt thread in an extended Samite weave. It was recreated from the inner fabric of a royal trouser worn in 1660s. The complexity, dexterity, imagination. Is this labor? Is this craft? Where was freedom in 1660s, the creative freedom? And how do we define and make these pieces our own? I think only an Indian weaver working in one of the few workshops in Banaras can create something as complex as this. With due respect to all other traditions, I'm only right now talking about Indian craft. Caste class language. The bodies that make a specific cloth are often the same bodies that are not allowed to wear it, because caste, money, language, other kinds of discriminations enter the fray. Chamar Studio. I'll probably talk about this and we'll run over this because you've seen enough of weaves in my presentation. Chamar Studio is a brand that was birthed in Dharavi, Bombay's or perhaps India's biggest slum, by a designer who went to architecture and art school and found that the slur, chamar means slur, it's a slur used for Dalits, for the untouchables. And he found that the slur was his identity. He turned the slur into the name of a brand, and Chamar Studio makes bags and shoes and art from recycled, wasted tires from trucks and cars, because tires have a certain feel that are akin to cow hide, to cow leather. When I asked Sudhir Rajbir, the designer, his face is not seen here, but he wanted to empower the chamars in the community by giving them these bags that retained their identity as chamar but didn't take away what they do. He said that the feel of the tire is akin to cowhide and they must be close to what they always have heard and done. Next slide, please. vernacular art and textiles. The idea that art and fashion and its core ideas are created in cities and verbal knowledge flows from designers who go to art schools and design colleges and they teach weavers what is design intervention is a flawed idea. So some work the other way around. Ajit Kumar, I'll choose one textile to speak to the most complex in the economy of time. This is an ikat weave in English. It is woven by a weaver called Saddam Guin in Odisha, who never went to English school. He wove the 20-point program during Indira Gandhi's rule. The 20-point program was about taxation, housing, healthcare, employment, education. The illiterate weaver used his ikat knowledge to recreate the 20-point program in art, and so the idea that textiles are wearables and textiles belong, the interventionist is an educated person, gets busted here. This was shown at an exhibition, and you can completely, comprehensively, legibly read this textile woven in ikat. This is made from Parsi Gara, but you can see it's a bust, so we'll go to the next slide. New textiles, fashions, parallel cinema. None of these existed until 10, 15 years back. They have all been created by designers who are revitalizing the identity of what is Indian. We can create clothes from recycled steel, from plastic. Is that our identity? Let's find out if it is. Next slide, please. Last slide. People, planet, climate, protest. A very important part of my work has been to talk about protest, rebellion, and change, and how identity shifts while the person remains the same through these ideas, and they are all a part of fashion journalism. Sheycha. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shefalee, for that incredibly insightful look into textile and attire beyond the glitz and glamour of the fashion world. Hello, everybody. My name is Sheycha Dem. I'm an artist and fashion designer, and I'm very happy to be here today. So to get started, Shefalee, I just wanted to read a line from your book, The Powder Room. And I feel like this kind of gives us an idea of what you do for your work as a writer and a cultural commentator. So the line is right at the introduction of the book, and it says, "A luxury watch worth 1 million rupees alongside a lenga embroidered by a craftsperson who could not afford to send his children to school would rattle my worldview." Now, I think your work as a writer and cultural commentator, as we saw, uses fashion as a thread to stitch together seamlessly the different parts of our lives that we would have never thought belonged together. And personally for me, I've always loved the idea that art and fashion always apply to all life. And what I mean by that is if you study the history of art or you study the history of fashion, you study the history of the world. Because if you look at any given point in time and you look at the garments that people were wearing at the time, you'll directly be informed of the social and political climate of the time. Do you agree? Now, as a prolific cultural commentator and editor-in-chief of The Voice of Fashion, how do you think historians 100 years from now, let's say, will describe the times we are going through in terms of fashion and attire as it relates to cultural identity?
Thank you, Sheycha. 100 years from now, that's a long time in an era of climate aggression, and things are going to shift. But I'm able to see this era as an almost beautiful conflict between our yearning for the vintage and for its nostalgia and romanticism and how it was made with its only actually technology, interventions, the Stella McCartney schools of design, the warm polymers, what you do with X-ray films. For instance, a designer duo in India, Abraham and Thakur, have cut X-ray films to the size of small sequins and embellished their garments with thrown X-ray films. There are many regenerative ideas that help you make sense that you are a part of struggling to stay in place while climate change is overtaking dialogues. When the COP summit started happening, fashion had no seat at the table. Today, the LVMH is a very important crusader and mover and shaker at what's going on. So 100 years later, I'm envisioning a Mahabharata between the romantic vintage lovers and the crusaders of the new through the plastics, recycled plastics, polymers, garments that wear differently, that don't have to be ironed, that should not be dry cleaned, that don't suffer from so much embellishment. I'm saying it very consciously because I think Indian couture, Indian wedding wear especially, suffers from embellishment. It has no other language but being decorative. But there is another school of creativity and design which is countering, and I see this Mahabharata 100 years later being retold as history. And not just in India, because India, the idea of vintage would be something else, but the conflict and coexistence of vintage with the new. And the new with an eye to preserve both animals and people and the planet and get the wage policies right and get legislations right. That's a concern for the entire world, global fashion.
I love that. I love, again, it just, more to the point of how fashion is connected to everything else. And I think we're going to be repeating this idea, throughout our talk. That is what it is about. But I love that, it's like you said about the fabrics, the new types of fabrics that might be developed as a result of climate change. I think one of the things that I personally love as, an artist or a fashion designer is that to be a good artist and to be a good fashion designer and to make good art and good design, you have to be informed about everything else. You have to know everything else. And what I mean by that is, if you only make art as an artist that just knows art, it's eventually going to become very boring. It's going to create this echo chamber that's going to collapse onto itself. And so, I feel like you have to know politics, architecture, music, and that in turn informs your art and design, and that in turn makes beautiful art and design. So I love your answer. Thank you very much. So I guess moving on, when we talk about cultural identity and fashion, and you mentioned it in your slides regarding the sari, we cannot not mention national dress. And me as a menswear designer that's been born and raised here, I love the men's ko, the traditional dress of the men of Bhutan. And I always wanted to incorporate it into my work as a standalone piece. And I'm actually reminded of an anecdote from your book on the chapter Dry Clean Only, where Rakesh Agrawal was advised by Sabyasachi about creating for Indian women. And he mentions how, he had a thought, like Rakesh Agrawal had this thought that he realized that he was under the impression that Western attire meant edgy and cool, whereas Indian wear was regressive. And I thought that was very interesting because I think that's a really real thought that is, relevant to all of us. And I guess I'm not going to go into that because then it has a lot to do with the Western narrative being the universal narrative, and we're not going to get into that. But I do think there is a shift in the way that these things that were previously seen as being other or less than are now coming into the limelight, being brought into the mainstream and celebrated. So, for me, I think if I were to incorporate the ko into my work, it wouldn't be creating a new version of it, because it's such a venerated symbol of national identity. There's no room for interpretation. It only has a single iteration. And, it's a garment that's very dear to my heart and dear to the hearts of many people here, I think. And I guess my question is, I think it deserves to be seen and celebrated within the vastness of mainstream fashion. So do you think that it would be possible for something like the ko to be a standalone piece, a standalone garment within mainstream fashion? And I guess this is the time to ask, where do you draw the line between appropriation and appreciation?
So as a Bhutanese designer, you creating versions, modernized or contemporary, both differently, of the Bhutanese men's garment is well within your creative rights. Cultural appropriation is about searching for inspiration online sometime, saying this is a yoga motif, that is a paisley from Kashmir, now let me make it as a French woman and call it inspired from India. That's one. Two is to know a little more through your design school or your education about how Northeast weaves its eri silk, or how Kanjivaram in Tamil Nadu weaves its mulberry silk, and then say, I'm going to appropriate this in my own way. I'll cut up the pieces, I'll make a jacket, not knowing that there are tribal identities, local identities, craftspersons' lives associated with those, and we may be disturbing those. You are in no danger of doing that. You are Bhutanese. The authenticity of your voice and whether you can make the Bhutanese men's garment a standalone piece of fashion in the world or not is going to be a challenge of your design aesthetic, your strategy as an entrepreneur and designer, not the fact that you're appropriating it. So you might want to ask the question in a different way. And you may have ways that Bhutan and the world wakes up to your garment, and it comes from an authentic voice. The very reason that you may be able to retain your voice amidst this cacophony that goes on in the fashion world is by being who you are.
Great point. I'll definitely keep that in mind as I continue with my design journey. I guess next thing I wanted to talk about, you mentioned artisans and craftsmen, and they're such an important part of the Indian fashion world. And I also really enjoyed your article on the Voice of Fashion about the math behind artisanal labor. And as a fashion designer who works with craftsmen, I work with a lot of traditional hand embroidery and traditionally hand-woven fabrics. I've always struggled with the concept of fair wages, and not because I don't think they deserve it, but actually the opposite problem. I'm a one-woman show, so I'm part of the entire process of creation, and I completely understand how grueling and how much time and effort and resources and just how many people it takes to create a single piece of clothing. But when you think about it, sometimes no matter how altruistic a fashion designer may be or may want to be, the ultimate definition of fairness may be dictated by other forces at place, like the market, the cost of fast-moving consumer products. And this means that craftsmen who are at the starting point of the supply chain are always the ones that get dealt with the shorter end of the stick. Because at the end of the day, a fashion house is still a business. And behind the intricate details of craftsmanship, there is still a need to make a profit. So my question, I guess, is do you think there is any way to address this issue without designers having to charge exorbitant prices for the garments that they create.
Designers, regardless of the arguments that we will share here, charge exorbitant prices for what they create. The fact that very recently it came to light that a Dior bag was created for some $250 or something of that nature in China or through other non-transparent supply chains, and it is retailed for 2,500 euros, tells us that the way there is the transparency about manufacturing, supply chain, who's making what, is missing. Why is fashion so unequal? Perhaps that's the question we are asking. Pricing of a garment, yes, it is justified by an atelier, production knowledge. So, for instance, I was once given a tour of a Louis Vuitton factory in Paris in Eniers, and I saw, I'm agnostic of the Louis Vuitton logo. Let's say I'm not a fan of it. It's too loud for me. It's, it disclaims too much status and wealth, and it could be a little quieter, only in my opinion. But when I went to this factory, I saw that a Louis Vuitton piece of luggage and bag was banged 300 times by a robotic hand on the ground to quality test its zipper. And 300 times the robotic hand would go from the ceiling to the floor, and if the zipper did not break at the end of it, the piece would be qualified for going into final manufacturing and clearance. And it completely changed what I felt about Louis Vuitton. The logo did not matter. The process mattered. Now, the processes of fashion, who makes it, artisanal knowledge, originality, and the value of the logo. Let's accept it that branding and logo take a product from the ground to the zenith. Those are going to be coded into the price. Equality is something else. There need to be clear laws on transparency, legality, wages that need to be reviewed by governments in different countries to say this is parity. Parity means men and women will be first paid equally. In Indian setups, often they are not. This is the minimum wage for somebody who's called a master craftsperson. A master craftsperson in India still earns 28,000 rupees a month, which is less than almost anything of a stitch that a designer may be making. A majority of artisans work between 12,000 and 18,000 rupees a month, and an even larger number work for about 5,000. This is on record in the same article that you are talking about, the math of artisanal labor. This can only be corrected by policy and legality. It's not an altruistic thought. It's not about going to a designer saying, you be kind, you are a nice person. This guy is not a nice person, so he can be unkind. It doesn't work like that. Uniformity, legality will address these things, and it's high time in this day and age of valuing artisanal culture so much, or revering the handmade for what we might be losing. As one of the speakers at this festival day before yesterday, speaking on Bhutanese identity, said that the last bus is leaving soon. If we are going to revere it, we must also address it through justice. So the justice argument has to be an economic one, not an altruistic one.
I agree. Thank you, Shefalee. I think everybody here will, pay extra mind and attention now, putting on the garments, every day at the start of the day. Think about where it comes from, who made it. Now, I think we're running out of time, but I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about your new book that we're all obviously looking forward to, that's coming out in 2025, tentatively titled, The Politics of Appearance. And I guess I just thought of a question in relation to appearance. I think it was Miuccia Prada who said, fashion is instant language. And I always loved that idea that clothes provide instantaneous communication. And now in this day and age where information is so easily accessible and instantaneous to everybody, and you can look up trends and styles, and people can dress in whichever way they want virtually, that you can dress however you want. Do you think people's expression of their identity through the clothes that they wear, do you think that it is authentic? And does it even matter in this day and age? And when we say fashion is a language, does it still apply to us in this day and age?
Fashion has never rescued the human being from themselves. Whatever we wear, unless we know how to wear it, unless it speaks to our body, how a weaver corresponds through the sound of the loom with what she is creating, how the needle becomes a stitch and becomes therapy, is individual. How you wear the kira and how I might try to wear it is going to be very different, never mind if Miuccia Prada came to our rescue. Do we need trends? Yes, we need trends to outfit us with a broad surround sound. This is what is going on in the world. Now you choose to be a rebel, a devotee, a soldier, whoever you want. It is going to be the person's reflection of how they can choose. Not everybody can be fashionable, they can be trendy. Even fewer will be stylish. So does fashion matter? It will continue to matter because it will stay ahead of us. It will not rescue us. And we will follow it in our own ways, one way or the other, I believe.
Thank you so much, Shefalee. I think that is all the time we have. Do we have time for questions? Okay. Any questions? No questions? Oh.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. My question is, how does traditional textile and attire influence contemporary fashion trend?
Influence? So, as I was earlier trying to say that tradition or culture is another word for the bedrock of labor. It stands for the materials we use, the silks and cottons and threads that may be used in Bhutan to weave your garments, or the materials that are used in India, or the silks, the chiffons of France. Those will always be the bedrock and the artisanal knowledge combined with artistic, architectural, fashion knowledge. They come together to create fashion. Without the traditional, there would be no fashion because there will be no cradle. It's like this, swaddling a child. You swaddle a child in the most basic fabric, and the child grows to be somebody who may be rejecting of that fabric. But swaddled she must be. That's the relationship, in my opinion, between traditional textiles and what becomes contemporary and fashion as it evolves into a language. And it is commercially determined. We must not forget that there's a commercial determination and propeller behind what becomes fashion.
Any other questions?
So I have wondered, I think the fashion industry is becoming more inhuman because in the past, the clothes were always about it being more comfortable to wear and aesthetic of it. But now, most of us, most of fashion, when I watch fashion shows in YouTube, I see clothes that are not wearable and that only shows a sense of art or something like that. So what is your thought about it?
So the shows that you watch on YouTube, presumably many of them might be haute couture, where the highest imaginative arc of fashion is attempted. They are created only for the ramp. They are bespoke and they conform to a original idea that may be a mix of human complexity, sometimes inspired by grief and lament, sometimes by wars, and sometimes by celebration of what royals wore and what royalty means in the contemporary world. By that measure, some of the couture garments, only as seen on the ramp, may appear to be not wearable. But when they walk out from the ramp to a store, they are taken down and made functional and wearable by design. Then the designer, working with shop owners, those who create consignments, their agents and all, create collections that are wearable, and one will be sold, one interpretation will be sold in Saudi Arabia and the other interpretation will be sold in Canada. In France, around the Couture Week, every season, there are several trade fairs where couturiers from all over the world, which never show on the ramp, come to show their wares, and they are interpreted for different regions, countries, demographics, bodies, etc. So what you see on the ramp is created for the ramp. On the other hand, I feel fashion, your sentence, is becoming more inhuman, I would agree, for completely different reasons. For the exoticization of certain ideas, for the cruel use still of alligator skin and other things, of the wage disparities, of discrimination, of caste issues, it's inhuman. But functional and creative wear is more in order today than it ever was in the world. Fashion is about athleisure and functionality. It's about comfort, and it's about using the finest cashmere that is made in this world for pants that you can only wear on a flight. Because and Xenia makes those cashmere athleisure drawstring pajamas that are only made for flight. So the entire spectrum has moved by, these are categories of fashion. You are free to buy couture or an unwearable lehenga. I'm free to buy a cashmere pajama. But fashion offers categories, and you should judge it by its categories and its humanity, or otherwise you should judge by what it does to its people.
We're out of time. Another question?
What kind of possibilities are there for an artisan to become a designer? Does technology, especially social media, help with that? Because otherwise the artisan always remains anonymous.
Social media doesn't make artists. As Terry Eagleton has argued in the London Review of Books, it makes us fools of paradise. And you can choose to be otherwise with great challenge. The fact that an artisan can become a designer is because there are scholarships, programs, smaller programs, and literacy through the enablement of vernacular ideas taken to design colleges, as well as in English education enablement in some pockets where the brighter generations, those interested in artisanal art, artisan art and craft, can be taken to fashion colleges and they will become designers. And in India, Sally Holkar runs the handloom school in Maheshwar, where the entire attempt is to bring children of artisans and give them a design education and make them designers should they wish to. And I can recite several such examples across India, where in small pockets, artisans are being given not just training on how to make a more design-attentive garment, but how to be an entrepreneur, how to create a brand, what are logos about, how to sell, and also on social media, including learning to photograph, price, and so forth. So the avenues have opened up, and there is great curiosity, and I think conversations like this only should impel those taking note to say, here is our mission, to not just work on NGO models of enablement, but to actually make the artisanal Gen Z. I say, why don't we hear about the Gen Z and millennial issues of artisans' children's? We have anxieties and depressions and this whole post-COVID mental health debacle that is happening to the world. What about the Gen Z anxieties of artisans' children? So it's all has to come together to see the lament, the possibilities, the anxieties, the neuroticism, and the potential for them to become a part of what we say is handmade or creative or designer impelled.